Never imagined my own son would push me so violently at the Christmas dinner table that I would fall to the floor in front of the entire family just so his father-in-law could take my place. It was supposed to be a moment of family togetherness, a time to celebrate the season and reflect on the years we had shared together. Instead, it became a night I would never forget, a night that would irrevocably change everything. What David didn't know was that on that very night, I would change his life forever. By the time he woke up the next day, 47 missed calls would be waiting for him. Sometimes the repercussions of our actions arrive when we least expect them, when we feel safe and in control, thinking that everything will remain the same forever. But life is rarely kind enough to keep us comfortable for too long. That night, the universe would teach him a lesson about respect, family, and the price of betrayal. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Michael Miller. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent my entire life building a business empire from scratch. Success wasn't handed to me. I worked for every penny. I earned the respect of my peers, and I built a legacy that would carry on for generations. But none of that mattered to my son anymore. I lost my beloved wife, Rose, 5 years ago, and since then, my son, David, became the most important thing in my world. At least that's what I thought until that Christmas Eve, the night of December 24th, 2024. I had planned everything perfectly. I arrived at David's house that afternoon with a heart full of joy. I was excited to see my grandkids, Jacob and Isabel, who always filled my life with energy and laughter. I had bought special gifts for them, carefully selected items that I knew they would love. For Jacob, a rare edition of a book he'd been asking for, and for Isabel, a beautiful necklace with a small diamond pendant. I also brought a $300 bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion, a bottle I thought would be perfect for the Christmas dinner. The house was decorated with golden lights, and the warm, inviting aroma of roast lamb filled the air. Everything seemed perfect. It was going to be a perfect night, I thought, as I walked in with a smile on my face. "Grandpa Michael," the children shouted as they ran towards me. Jacob, at 15, was already taller than me, while Isabel, 12, still clung to my neck like she did when she was little. I had always cherished these moments with them, their hugs, their laughter, the way they looked at me as if I were their hero. Their sincere hugs were the only moment of genuine happiness I would experience that night. "Hi, Grandpa," Jacob said, his voice full of warmth. His eyes sparkled, and I could see that he was growing up so quickly. I remembered the days when he was just a little boy sitting on my knee as I told him stories of the old days. But now he was a young man, almost an adult, standing taller than I had ever expected. Isabel looked up at me with her big brown eyes, her smile a bit shy but still full of that innocent affection that only a child could give. She wrapped her arms around me as I bent down to embrace her. "Hi, Grandpa," she whispered. "I missed you." "I missed you too, sweetheart," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I held her for just a little longer, savoring the fleeting moments of innocence. Teresa, my daughter-in-law, greeted me with a strained grin. She was always polite, but there was something in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't hatred. No, that was too harsh. But there was something in the way she looked at me, something in the way she measured every word I said. It was like she was constantly evaluating me, trying to decide if I was still the same man she once knew, or if I had become something else over the years. I could never quite put my finger on it, but I knew that the warmth I once felt from her was gone. "Hi, Michael. So glad you got here early," she said, her voice a little too bright, too forced. David appeared from the kitchen, but his greeting was distant, almost mechanical. "Hey, Dad, just leave your coat there." He barely looked at me as he gestured toward the coat rack. It wasn't the usual warm, "Hi, Dad," that I had grown accustomed to hearing. This was different. This was cold, distant. I noticed something strange in the atmosphere, something I couldn't put into words right away. There was tension in the air and unspoken discomfort that I couldn't quite identify. The table was set for 8 people, but there were only 6 of us: David, Teresa, the kids, me, and we were waiting for someone else. "Is someone else coming?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Yes, my father will be here in a moment." Teresa answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was referring to Anthony Moore, a 72-year-old businessman who had always been my silent competitor in the business world. We had been in similar circles for years, but where I had focused on building my empire through hard work and persistence, Anthony had always been more opportunistic. He knew the right people, made the right deals, and played the game in ways that often made me uncomfortable. But we had always managed to keep things professional. At least I thought we had. When Anthony arrived, everything changed. David completely transformed, becoming helpful and attentive in a way I had never seen with me. "Mr. Moore, what a pleasure to have you here. Come in," he said, his tone sweet, almost ingratiating. It was as though he had suddenly become a different person, one who was eager to impress. I thought it was strange, but I decided to ignore it. After all, it was Christmas, and I wanted to enjoy it with my family. I was hopeful that perhaps I was overthinking things. We sat down at the table, and I took my usual spot, the one that had always been mine. It was at the head of the table, right next to David. But as Anthony approached, David looked at me with an expression I would never forget: cold, calculating, ruthless. "Dad, I need you to get up from there." "What?" I asked, confused. "Why?" "That seat is for Mr. Moore. He's the guest of honor." I felt like I had been slapped across the face. "David, I've always sat here. It's my place in this family." The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Teresa was looking down, uncomfortable. The kids had stopped talking. Anthony stood there watching the scene with a mix of awkwardness and contentment. "Dad, don't make this difficult. Move." "I don't understand, David. What's going on here?" That's when it happened. David walked over to me, put his hands on my shoulders, and pushed me with such strength that I lost my balance. My 68-year-old body couldn't handle the force, and I crashed heavily to the floor in front of the entire family. The silence that followed was deafening. The children screamed my name. Teresa brought her hands to her mouth. Anthony remained motionless, but I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone: contentment. From the floor, hurt and embarrassed, I heard the words that would change everything forever. "This seat belongs to my father-in-law. Get out." In that moment, as I lay on the chilly ceramic flooring, something inside me broke. Not just my dignity, but something much deeper. The image I had of my son, the unwavering affection I felt for him, crumbled like a house of cards. The kids helped me up, their faces filled with confusion and pain. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" Isabel whispered with tears in her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetie," I lied, stroking her hair. But inside, a storm had begun to brew. David had already taken his seat at the table as if nothing had happened. Anthony occupied my chair without a word. Teresa served dinner with nervous movements, avoiding my gaze. I sat in a side chair like a second-class guest in what used to be my own family. During the entire dinner, I watched how David spoke to Anthony with the respect he had never shown me. I watched how Teresa hung on every word of the man who now sat in my place. I watched how my grandkids looked at me with sadness, unable to understand why their father had dishonored their grandfather. And as I watched, I made a choice that would change our lives forever. The dinner proceeded in a tense atmosphere that felt as thick as smoke. Every bite tasted like treason. Every laugh shared between David and Anthony pierced my soul like sharp daggers. My grandkids tried to fill the silence with innocent comments about their schoolwork, but even they could sense that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. The tension at the table was unbearable. It felt like the air was thick with unspoken words, with actions left unsaid. I kept my gaze on my plate, my fork and knife moving mechanically as I tried to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the pain. But every bite felt like betrayal. Every laugh shared between David and Anthony pierced my heart like a dagger. David, my son, whom I had raised with love and care, had just humiliated me in front of my own family. And for what? To make space for a man who had never treated me with the same respect. Anthony Moore, a man I had competed with for years in business, but had never considered as part of my personal life. A man who had always been a shadow in my world, lurking in the background, but never truly a threat. Yet here he was, seated at the head of the table, taking my place, both literally and figuratively. I watched as David and Anthony exchanged pleasantries, their voices light and full of camaraderie. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had simply stepped out of the picture, my place in the family replaced without a second thought. And the worst part was that I knew David had made his choice. He had chosen Anthony over me. The betrayal stung like nothing I had ever felt before. The kids were quiet. Jacob, usually full of energy and eager to talk about his schoolwork, sat with his head down, his face unreadable. Isabel, who had always been so open and loving, clung to her mother's side, looking up at me with confusion in her eyes. They couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't grasp the magnitude of the moment, but they could feel the tension. They could sense that something had shifted in the family, and it hurt them too. Jacob got straight A's this semester, I said, my voice breaking the silence, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, trying to fill the space with something that reminded us of the family we once were. But even my attempt to keep the conversation going felt forced. David barely looked up from his plate. "Oh, right," he muttered, his eyes focused entirely on the lamb he was serving to Anthony. "Mr. Moore, is the lamb cooked to your liking?" It was as if I had become invisible. I sat there watching the scene unfold, a stranger in my own family. The man I had raised, the man I had sacrificed so much for, was treating me like an outsider, a distant relative, not even worthy of respect, and I couldn't understand why. What had changed? What had happened to the bond we once shared, the love that I had poured into his life? And then it hit me. The moment I had been blind to, the truth that had been in front of me all along. I had given everything to David. I had worked tirelessly to build a life for him, to create a legacy for him to inherit. I had sacrificed time with my wife, time with my family, to ensure that he would have the best possible future. And yet, here he was, choosing Anthony over me, choosing to tear our family apart for the sake of some fleeting sense of success or approval from someone who had never been there for him the way I had. The dinner dragged on in an uncomfortable silence. I couldn't bring myself to eat. Every bite tasted like ash in my mouth. Every laugh, every word exchanged between David and Anthony felt like a slap in the face. It was as if I had become the ghost of the family, someone who no longer mattered, someone who was no longer welcome at the table. I excused myself from the table, muttering something about needing to use the restroom. I couldn't sit there any longer. I couldn't bear the sight of David and Anthony enjoying their meal while I felt like I had been cast aside, forgotten. I walked slowly to the bathroom, each step heavier than the last as the weight of the situation settled on my shoulders. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and stood there in front of the mirror. The man staring back at me was someone I hardly recognized. The anger in my eyes was replaced by a deep, aching sadness. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I knew what needed to be done. I had no choice. If David wanted to strip me of my dignity, I would show him the consequences of his actions. It wasn't revenge I sought, it was justice. I called my lawyer, Edward Roberts, who had been with me for over 25 years. His sleepy voice answered on the fourth ring. "Michael, it's Christmas Eve. What's the emergency?" "Edward, I need you to prepare documents first thing tomorrow morning to revoke all the powers of attorney David has in the company. All of them, without exception." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Edward knew my business structure as well as I did. He knew how much power David had held for years, how much trust I had placed in him. But now everything had changed. "Michael, are you sure? That would mean—" "I know exactly what it means," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I also want you to cancel every financial guarantee I've co-signed for him. The house, the car, the corporate credit cards, everything." "What happened?" Edward asked, his tone suddenly more serious. "My son just showed me who he really is, and now I'm going to show him who I am." The conversation ended quickly, and I felt a sense of cold clarity settle over me. I wasn't angry, I was done. David had crossed a line, and now it was my turn to make a move. I wouldn't let him get away with this. I called Linda Vance, my CFO and accountant, next. She had been with the company for years, and she knew all the ins and outs of our finances. "Linda, I'm sorry to bother you. I need you to freeze all joint accounts with David first thing in the morning. Also, suspend his salary and executive benefits." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Is there a legal problem, Mr. Miller?" she asked. "No, Linda, I'm just taking back control of what belongs to me." The third call I made was the most important. I called Robert Pfizer, my second in command at the company. Robert had been with me from the beginning, and I trusted him implicitly. "Robert, forgive the hour, but I need you to go to the office early tomorrow morning. I need you to remove all of David's personal belongings from his office." "Are you firing him, boss?" "Yes, he is no longer the CEO. You will take his position starting tomorrow. Prepare an immediate termination letter, justifiable cause, loss of confidence." "Understood, Mr. Miller. Anything else?" "Yes. place a note on his desk that says, "This office is not for you." I want him to understand the message perfectly. I sat down on the edge of the sink, my mind racing as I thought about the next steps. This wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching David a lesson he would never forget. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me anymore, not after everything I had done for him. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still as the rest of the city lay quiet under a blanket of snow. The warmth of the holiday season seemed to have been stripped away, leaving only the cold truth of what had transpired. As I sat in my study, sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but think back to the years I had spent building this empire, to all the sacrifices I had made for my family. I had worked 18-hour days, neglected my own health, and put aside personal time, all so that my son David could inherit it one day. And what had I received in return? Disrespect, betrayal, and unforgivable humiliation. I looked at my phone. One missed call. It was from Edward, my lawyer. I had expected this. "Michael," Edward's voice came through the phone, a little more alert than the night before. "The documents are ready. Everything is in place." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Good. Send them over and make sure David gets them today, and cancel everything he has with my name on it. The guarantees, the credit cards, everything." "Understood," Edward replied. "This will have a ripple effect, Michael." "You're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure," I said coldly. It's time he learned the consequences of his actions. After I hung up, I turned my attention to the task at hand. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was doing what needed to be done. David had made his choice, and now it was time for him to feel the weight of that decision. It wasn't just about the money, it was about his lack of respect, his disregard for everything I had worked for, and his willingness to betray his own blood for the sake of a fleeting alliance with Anthony Moore. Later that morning, I received a text from Linda confirming that all the joint accounts had been frozen. David's salary and benefits had been suspended. The financial chain I had co-signed for him had been cut. I felt a cold satisfaction course through me. This wasn't easy. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it was necessary. David had crossed a line, and now there were no more safety nets for him. I sat down at my desk and reviewed the termination letter that Robert had prepared for David. It was sharp, professional, and precise. Justifiable cause, loss of confidence. The words burned in my chest, but I knew they were true. My own son had humiliated me in front of the family, and it was clear he no longer deserved the position he held. As I signed the letter, I felt something inside me shift. This was it. There was no going back now. I had made my choice. My actions would show David that he couldn't take me for granted anymore. He would learn, even if it meant losing everything. David had been unusually quiet that morning. He had stayed up late the night before, most likely brooding over the events of the previous evening. I wasn't sure what to expect when he came into the office, but part of me knew that the shock would hit him harder than anything else. By the time I arrived at the office, everything was in motion. Robert had already cleared out David's desk and personal belongings. The note had been placed exactly where it needed to be. The office was no longer his. I watched from the corner of the office as David stepped out of the elevator. He looked disoriented, confused. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment he seemed to forget why he was there. The realization hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. Robert stood by the door, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller, you're not expected here anymore," he said flatly, holding up the termination letter. David's face twisted in disbelief. "What is this? Robert, what the hell is going on?" "This office is not for you," Robert said, pointing to the note in the center of David's desk. It was clear that Robert wasn't going to sugarcoat it. David had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. David stood frozen, staring at the note as though it were a foreign language. "What is this? My father wouldn't do this. He can't." "Oh, but he did," Robert interrupted. "And I suggest you read the letter. It's all there, David." David hesitated for a moment before snatching the letter from the desk. His eyes scanned the words, his face growing paler with each line. I could see the disbelief, the anger building inside him. He looked up at Robert, his voice shaking. "Where is he?" he demanded. "Where is my father? He can't do this to me. He can't just take everything away." Robert didn't flinch. "I suggest you gather your things, David. You've been relieved of your position, and the decision is final." David's hands trembled as he shoved the papers into his briefcase. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice a mixture of rage and desperation. "I'm going to fix this. I'll talk to him. But as he turned to leave, I stepped out from behind my desk and spoke for the first time. No, David, I said, my voice calm but steady. This is the end of the road for you. You've crossed the line and there's no going back. You wanted to take my place. Now you can see what it's like when someone takes yours. His eyes locked onto mine, but I didn't flinch. I stood my ground. The power had shifted, and I wasn't going to let him control the narrative any longer. The rest of the day was a blur. I didn't stay in the office long. I had already made my decision and I had executed it. There was no turning back. As I walked through the halls, I felt the weight of my choices. Every step I took felt like it carried a piece of my past, a piece of the man I had once been, the man who believed in family and loyalty and doing what was right. But now I had to accept that the rules had changed. I returned home later that evening, the chill of the air biting at my skin. The house felt colder than usual, emptier somehow. The laughter that had once filled these walls had been replaced by the hollow sound of silence. I sat down in the study, my mind racing with everything that had happened. My thoughts drifted back to the dinner, to the humiliation I had suffered at the hands of my own son, to the pain of seeing him choose someone else over me. But I also realized that I had done the right thing. Sometimes, as parents, we have to make hard choices. Sometimes we have to let go. And while David's future was now uncertain, I had done what I could to ensure that the family name and legacy would remain intact. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about teaching him the value of respect, of integrity, and the importance of making the right decisions. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This concludes part 3, where the consequences begin to unfold for David, and Michael stands firm in his decision. Days following Christmas passed slowly. For David, each morning felt like waking up to a new reality. The chaos of his world crumbling around him had left him disoriented, unable to make sense of the decisions that had led to this point. He had been brought up to believe in the importance of family, of loyalty, of honor, yet in his quest for approval from Anthony, he had betrayed everything he had once held dear. The calls from the banks, the repossession orders, the termination from the company, each one hit harder than the last. As he sat in his empty apartment, the starkness of his new life slowly seeped into his bones. There was no going back. His father had made sure of that. David had spent years building his life around the privileges he thought would always be there, the wealth, the power, the company he had inherited. But now, in the blink of an eye, it was all gone. And the worst part was that he knew it was his own fault. He had pushed his father too far. He had believed that his success and his position were secure no matter what. But in doing so, he had forgotten one fundamental truth: nothing is guaranteed. Not even family. The apartment felt cold, even with the heat turned on. The empty walls stared back at him, reminding him of everything he had lost. He had given up his position as CEO, but more importantly, he had lost the respect of the one person who had always believed in him, his father. David leaned back on the couch, his hand resting on his forehead as he tried to process everything. His mind kept returning to that Christmas night, the night that had torn everything apart. He had shoved his father to the ground. His own father, the man who had raised him, who had worked tirelessly to give him everything, only to see him betrayed in front of his own family. The image of his father lying on the cold floor haunted him. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the emotional destruction that David had caused. The wound he had inflicted would never heal. He had been so consumed with impressing Anthony, with securing a business deal, that he had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered: his relationship with his father. The man who had sacrificed everything for him, who had built the empire he had inherited, was now a stranger to him. As the days went by, David tried to salvage what little he had left. He began applying for jobs, but the weight of his last name carried a burden that he hadn't fully understood until now. No one wanted to hire the son of Michael Miller. His reputation, once a source of pride, had become a liability. His phone calls were ignored, his emails unanswered. The door that had once opened for him because of his last name now slammed shut in his face. He had reached out to a few of his old business contacts, but they all responded with polite refusals, avoiding his calls, pretending they didn't know him. His father's name was no longer a blessing, it was a curse. David had always relied on his father's power and influence to carve out his own path. But now, as he sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, He realized just how fragile his life had been. He had been given everything without ever having to earn it. And now, with everything stripped away, he was left with nothing. He had no job, no money, no family, and worse than all of that, he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, Michael continued with his life, but something had shifted within him. The decision to take control of his company, to revoke David's access, had been difficult, but it had been necessary. He had spent decades building this empire, sacrificing so much of himself to ensure his family had everything they could ever want. But in the end, it had come down to one harsh truth. He had done too much for David and had expected too little in return. Michael had always believed that family was everything, that loyalty, respect, and love should be the foundation of all relationships. But as he sat in his study, looking over the legal documents he had signed to finalize the termination of David's role in the company, he couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, not just for the company or the wealth that had been stripped away from David, but for the relationship he had once had with his son. It wasn't supposed to be like this. David had been the one person who could have carried on his legacy, who could have taken over the family business, but David's choices had left Michael with no choice but to let him go. Michael had spent his life focused on building something that would last, a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. But as he reflected on his relationship with David, he realized how much he had neglected in the process. He had sacrificed family time, his health, and his happiness in the pursuit of success. And now, as he sat alone in his study, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. There was no time for regret. The future was uncertain, and Michael knew that there were still decisions to be made. The company was his, and he had to move forward. His partnership with Anthony was growing stronger, and there were new projects on the horizon. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a father who had lost his son. David's days in the apartment were filled with constant searching, a sense of urgency pushing him to do something to get his life back. He took a job as a cleaner at a local industrial cleaning company just to have something to do, something to hold on to. It was a humbling experience, to say the least. The work was grueling, the pay was low, and the people he worked with didn't know or care who he was. But in some strange way, it felt like the first step toward his redemption. The first few days were the hardest. He had always worn designer suits, driven a luxury car, and lived in a beautiful home. Now he was wearing a faded blue uniform and scrubbing floors in the dead of night. He spent his shifts cleaning office buildings, empty corporate spaces where the only sound was the hum of the vacuum cleaner and the click of his cleaning supply. The physical labor was grueling, but it gave him time to think. David had lost everything: his job, his wealth, his status. But as he worked late into the night, he realized something important. He was beginning to understand the value of hard work, the value of humility, the value of earning his keep. The people he worked with were a mix of immigrants, retirees, and single mothers, people who worked long hours just to make ends meet. They didn't care about his past. They didn't care who he was or where he came from. They respected him because he worked alongside them, doing the same hard work they did. For the first time in his life, David felt like he was earning his way. By the end of the month, David had adapted to his new routine. He still hadn't found a permanent job in his old field, but he had begun to rebuild his life piece by piece. He shared a small room in a shared apartment, living on the bare minimum. $1,200 a month he made from the cleaning job barely covered his rent and food, but it was enough. One night, while cleaning the Willis Tower, he looked out over the city. The skyline was beautiful, filled with lights and promise. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of hope. Not the hope of returning to his old life, but the hope of building something new, something authentic, something earned. As he walked through the streets, David realized that he had learned something important. He had learned what it meant to truly work for something, to earn it with his own hands and efforts. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. Months had passed since that fateful Christmas dinner. The cold winter had given way to spring, and Chicago had slowly begun to thaw. Yet, for David, the weight of the past still clung to him, heavy and unyielding. The decision he had made that night, pushing his father, his own flesh and blood, had set in motion a series of events that could never be undone. But for the first time in a long while, David felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from financial security or social status. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from success or accolades. It was the peace of knowing that he was finally standing on his own 2 feet. The road had been hard, harder than anything he had ever imagined, but it had taught him lessons he would never forget. David had continued with his cleaning job, and although it wasn't glamorous, it was honest work. He had learned humility, the kind of humility he had never known before. His hands, once soft from years of office work, were now calloused and rough from handling cleaning tools. His designer suits had been replaced with faded uniforms, and his luxury car had been repossessed. But as he worked late nights, scrubbing floors in empty office buildings, something inside him began to shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was beginning to rebuild. In the evenings, after his shifts, he would call his children. Jacob, now 16, had become more mature than David had ever anticipated. Isabel, 13, was still full of innocence, but her bright eyes were tinged with sadness whenever she spoke of him. The hardest part was knowing that his children, his flesh and blood, were caught in the middle. They had been forced to choose between him and his father, and although they never said it outright, David could sense their growing disappointment. The gap between them had widened, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bridge it. Yet there was a small flicker of hope. They hadn't given up on him, not yet, and that, he realized, was the one thing he had left, the love of his children. One evening after a particularly grueling shift, David sat down to a simple meal in his tiny apartment. The food was nothing special, just a sandwich and a bottle of water, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't starving anymore. He wasn't struggling to survive. He was living, and it was enough. As he ate, his phone rang. It was Jacob. "Hey, Dad," Jacob said, his voice sounding a little more cheerful than usual. "How's it going?" "Hey, kiddo," David replied, his voice softening. "It's going okay, same old, same old." David could hear Jacob fidgeting, unsure of how to continue. "Dad, Grandpa asked about you today." David's heart skipped a beat. His father, Michael, hadn't reached out to him in months. The silence between them had been deafening. But now Jacob was telling him that his father had asked about him. David swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Really?" he asked, his breath catching in his throat. "Yeah, he asked if you were okay, if you had a job, if you were living all right. I told him you're doing better, but I don't know the details. You didn't want to worry us." David closed his eyes, the weight of the moment settling on him. His father had asked about him. For the first time, it felt like a tiny crack had appeared in the wall that had divided them, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to heal the wound he had inflicted on their relationship. How did he react? David asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I hope he's learning what he needs to learn." David sat back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind. His father hadn't completely given up on him. There was still hope, however small. He wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. But he had acknowledged that David was trying, that he was learning. "Thanks for telling me, Jacob," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate it. We love you, okay? No matter what happened with Grandpa, we still love you." David's throat tightened. The simplicity of his son's words cut deeper than anything else. He had been so focused on rebuilding his own life that he had neglected the most important thing, the love of his children. They had been through so much, and yet they still loved him. He wasn't sure if he deserved it, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove to them that he was worthy of their trust. The next day, David woke up early and went for a walk through the city. The streets were quieter than usual, the cold air biting at his skin, but he welcomed it. He needed the clarity, the solitude to think. As he walked, he passed by the tall buildings that had once seemed like symbols of his success. Now, they only reminded him of the person he had once been, a man consumed by pride and arrogance, blind to the things that truly mattered. He stopped in front of a cafe, the same cafe he used to visit with his father when they would discuss business. He had long since stopped going there, but today he felt the need to sit down and think. As he entered, the warmth of the cafe enveloped him. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the busy street. He thought about his father, about Michael. He thought about the man who had given him everything, who had worked tirelessly to build a legacy, only to see his own son destroy it in a moment of weakness. But as David sat there sipping his coffee, he realized something that had been eluding him for months. His father had done what was necessary. He had made a hard choice, one that was painful for both of them, but it was the only choice he could have made. David had pushed him too far. He had taken his father's love and trust for granted, but now he was starting to understand the true meaning of sacrifice, the true cost of loyalty. He had lost everything, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained a sense of self-worth, a sense of dignity that came from hard work and humility. Later that week, David received another call from Jacob. "Dad," Jacob said, his voice sounding more hopeful than ever. "Grandpa, he said he wants to see you. He wants to meet up." David's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. After all that had happened, Michael was willing to meet with him. "Are you serious?" David asked, his voice trembling. "He actually wants to see me. He's proud of the changes you've made. He doesn't want to hold on to the past anymore. He said he's ready to move forward." David couldn't speak. His father, the man he had hurt, the man he had betrayed, was willing to give him another chance. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. David met Michael in a quiet cafe a few days later. The moment he saw his father, he was overwhelmed by a rush of emotions: guilt, regret, hope. Michael looked older, but there was a strength in his eyes that David hadn't seen in months. "Sit down," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." David sat down across from him, his hands trembling. He didn't know what to say, how to begin, but Michael spoke first. "I've been watching you, David," Michael said, his eyes never leaving his son's. "I see the work you're doing, the effort you're putting into rebuilding your life. I see you trying to learn the lessons that should have been taught a long time ago." David swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I've hurt you. I can't take back what I've done, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." Michael looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you're trying. That's all I can ask for. But don't expect me to just forget. There are consequences for our actions, and you've learned that the hard way." David nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I understand, and I'm sorry." Michael stood up and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're not the man I thought you were, but maybe you can become the man I know you can be. It's going to take time, David, but we'll get there." As David left the cafe that day, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't known in months. The road ahead was uncertain, and there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. And no matter what happened, he knew one thing: he would never take his father's love for granted again. Final conclusion: the healing weeks passed, and though life had begun to take on a new rhythm for both David and Michael, the echoes of the past still lingered. For David, each day was a step toward redemption, a chance to prove to himself and to his father that he was capable of change. The road was not easy. Old habits die hard, and despite the progress he had made, there were moments when doubt crept in, moments when he questioned whether he could truly rebuild his life from the ruins he had created. But every time those moments of doubt surfaced, he reminded himself of the people he had left to fight for: his children, who still loved him unconditionally, and his father, who, despite everything, had extended a hand towards reconciliation. And it was that simple act of grace from Michael that had begun to shift something deep within David. David's work as a cleaner continued, but now he had become more than just a worker. He was earning his place step by step. His interactions with his coworkers were different. He listened more. He learned about their lives, their struggles. He understood that the value of a person isn't determined by their wealth, their status, or the brand of their suit. It was determined by the kindness they extended to others, the effort they put into their work, and the integrity they maintained in the face of adversity. David had learned to appreciate the simplicity of life, the small victories that made each day meaningful. No longer consumed by greed or the desire to impress others, he found fulfillment in the honest work he was doing. There was dignity in it, dignity he had never truly known before. One afternoon, while cleaning a corporate office building, David's phone rang. It was Jacob. "Dad, Grandpa wants to meet with you again. He said it's time to talk about something important," Jacob said, his voice filled with both excitement and caution. David paused, his heart beating faster. Every part of him had hoped for this moment, but hearing it from Jacob made it real. This wasn't just another phone call, it was the moment he had been waiting for. "Are you sure?" David asked, his voice shaky. "I'm sure," Jacob replied. "He's been talking a lot about the future lately. He wants to know if you're really ready to take the next step." David closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. There were still wounds that needed healing, both in his heart and in his relationship with his father. But if Michael was willing to meet him halfway, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild the bridge that had been burned. The next day, David drove to the cafe where he and Michael had met weeks ago. The same familiar feelings of anxiety and anticipation welled up inside him as he parked his car and made his way inside. Michael was already seated at a corner table, his expression neutral, but there was something different in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence, a sense of calm that had been absent in their previous encounters. David sat down across from him, unsure of what to say. The weight of the past still loomed over them, but there was a sense of resolution in the air, an understanding that the past was the past and the future was where the real work needed to be done. "You've been doing well, David," Michael said after a long silence. His voice was softer than usual, but still firm. "I've been hearing about your work. I'm proud of you, not just for what you've done, but for the way you've changed. It wasn't easy for me to let go of the past, to let go of the idea of what you could have been. But now I see that you're becoming the man I always hoped you could be." David swallowed hard, his emotions overwhelming him. He had waited so long to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, they felt like a gift he had never earned. "I don't know if I deserve your pride, Dad," David said quietly, his voice trembling. "I made so many mistakes. I hurt you. I hurt the whole family, and I don't know if I can make it right, but I'm trying. I'm really trying." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "You've already done what needed to be done, David. You've taken responsibility for your actions. You've humbled yourself. And that, more than anything, is what matters. Not the money, not the title, not the past. What matters is who you are now and who you choose to be moving forward." David's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't expected this conversation to go the way it had. He had braced himself for more rejection, more harsh words, but instead his father was offering him something far more precious: acceptance. "I can't fix everything, Dad," David said, his voice choked with emotion. "But I'll do everything I can to be the man you've always wanted me to be, the man I should have been." Michael reached across the table and placed a hand on his son's. "I think you already are, David." Weeks turned into months, and slowly Michael and David began to rebuild their relationship. Trust had been broken, and time had to be spent regaining what had been lost. But the foundation had been laid, and both father and son were committed to the work that lay ahead. David's life began to shift. He found a steady job, not in the family business, but in a small construction company that valued his skills and integrity. He worked hard, and every paycheck he received was a symbol of his effort, something he had earned on his own. Meanwhile, Michael's business continued to thrive. His partnership with Anthony was growing stronger, and new projects were on the horizon. But he no longer measured success by the size of the projects or the wealth they generated. Now, success was measured by the integrity of the people he worked with, by the relationships he nurtured, and by the lessons he could pass down to his children and grandchildren. 1 year later, Michael and David sat in the same cafe where they had first met. The world outside was bustling with the energy of a new year, and the air was filled with the promise of what was to come. But in that moment, both father and son were content. "I'm proud of you, David," Michael said, his voice steady but warm. "You've come a long way." David smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "I'm proud of you too, Dad, and I'm thankful for everything you've taught me." The past was no longer a shadow that haunted their relationship. They had moved forward step by step, and though the road had been long and painful, it had led them to this place, a place of understanding, respect, and love. "I don't know if we'll ever fully heal the past," David said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." Michael nodded. "That's all we can do: move forward, learn from our mistakes, and make the best of what we have." As they left the cafe together, walking side by side, they both knew that the journey of reconciliation was far from over. But for the first time in years, they were walking it together.